The air in the grand concert hall felt electric that morning. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting golden patterns across the polished wooden floor where the Westmoreland Symphony Orchestra was setting up for rehearsal. Musicians unpacked their instruments, the familiar chaos of tuning strings and warming brass creating the special symphony that always preceded the actual music. In the back of the hall, clutching a worn leather satchel full of sheet music, stood a young man with dark, tousled hair and eyes that couldn't decide if they were more nervous or excited. This was Li Wei, fresh from the conservatory, his diploma still new enough that he could remember the feeling of it being placed in his hands. Today marked his first day as the newest pianist for one of the country's most respected orchestras. First day, a violinist with kind eyes noticed him hovering by the entrance. Li Wei nodded, his throat suddenly dry. "Is it that obvious?" The violinist laughed. "We all had a first day once. Don't worry, just don't get on the old man's bad side and you'll be fine." The old man. "Maestro Vittorio, our conductor." The violinist gestured toward the front of the hall where a slender man with wild silver hair was arranging his score sheets with the precision of a surgeon. "Brilliant, but—" He twirled a finger near his temple. "Li." Wei had heard the stories about Maestro Vittorio Rossi. The Italian conductor was a legend in classical music circles, both for his musical genius and his explosive temper. Former students described him as Mozart's talent trapped in a volcano's temperament. "Thanks for the warning," Li Wei said, adjusting his collar. He'd practiced 16 hours a day for weeks after getting this position. Surely that would count for something. The rehearsal call came and musicians took their places. Li Wei made his way toward the gleaming black grand piano positioned prominently near the conductor's stand. The instrument was magnificent, a Steinway concert grand that looked as though it had been polished with liquid moonlight. His fingers itched to touch the keys, to feel their weight and responsiveness before the music began. He was 3 steps away from the piano bench when a voice cracked through the air like a whip. "Don't touch my piano, poor guy." The entire orchestra froze. Conversations died mid-sentence. Someone's bow clattered to the floor in the sudden silence. Li Wei stood paralyzed, his hand suspended in mid-air. He turned slowly to find Maestro Vittorio staring at him with the intensity of a hawk spotting a field mouse. I'm the new pianist," Li Wei managed to say, his voice barely audible even to himself. "Li Wei Chen." The conductor's eyebrows shot up. "Are you now? And did anyone give you permission to touch that piano?" His Italian accent grew thicker with his agitation. Li Wei looked around, confused. "I thought, since I was hired as the pianist, you thought wrong." Vittorio slammed his baton against his music stand, making everyone jump. "That is not just any piano. That is a voice, a soul, a living piece of musical history. It does not tolerate just anyone's fingers upon its keys." From the corner of his eye, Li Wei could see the other musicians exchanging glances. Some looked embarrassed, others sympathetic. The violinist who had spoken to him earlier gave a tiny shrug that seemed to say, "I tried to warn you." "Forgive me, Maestro," Li Wei said, taking a step back from the piano. "I didn't realize—" "Of course you didn't realize," Vittorio interrupted, his voice softening marginally. "You are young, inexperienced, fresh from school where they teach technique but not respect." He gestured to a woman seated near the back. "Mrs. Huang, please show our new arrival to the practice room. He can use the upright until I decide he's ready." Mrs. Huang, an older woman who played second violin, rose and beckoned to Li Wei. With burning cheeks and eyes fixed on the floor, he followed her out of the main hall, acutely aware of 40 pairs of eyes watching his humiliating exit. "Don't take it personally," Mrs. Huang said as they walked down a corridor lined with photographs of famous musicians who had performed with the orchestra. "Vittorio does this to every new pianist. He forbids them from using the grand piano?" Li Wei asked, still bewildered. Mrs. Huang nodded. "That piano belonged to his mentor, who was something of a prodigy back in the 1950s. When the old man died, he left it to Vittorio, who donated it to the orchestra on the condition that he maintained sole authority over who plays it. But I was hired to play piano for the orchestra," Li Wei protested. "How am I supposed to do that from a practice room?" "You'll get your chance," she assured him. "But first, Vittorio needs to believe you understand what that piano means. It's not just an instrument to him, it's a sacred trust." The practice room was small but well lit with an upright piano that had seen better days. The ivory on some keys was yellowed with age. and a small crack ran along the wooden panel above middle C. Still, when Li Wei tentatively played a few notes, the sound was surprisingly warm and resonant. "It's not as bad as it looks," Mrs. Huang said with a smile. This was the piano they used for children's lessons when the orchestra ran a community school. "More talent has passed through those keys than you might think." Li Wei nodded, running his fingers over the keys more confidently now. "What happens next?" he asked. "How long before I'm allowed near the sacred piano?" Mrs. Huang laughed. "That depends entirely on you. The last pianist took 3 months to win Vittorio's approval. The one before that never did. He quit after 6 weeks. She paused at the door. "The trick isn't to prove you're good enough for the piano. It's to prove you care about the music more than your own ego." After she left, Li Wei sat at the upright piano for a long time without playing. The morning's events replayed in his mind, each moment of embarrassment stinging like a fresh paper cut. He had come here with such high hopes, such grand dreams of dazzling everyone with his talent. Instead, he'd been publicly humiliated and banished to a practice room before playing a single note. Part of him wanted to pack up and leave, to tell the great maestro Vittorio exactly what he could do with his precious piano. Li Wei had other offers, smaller orchestras, teaching positions, places where he'd be respected from day one. But another part of him, the part shaped by years of discipline and sacrifice, was intrigued by the challenge. What was so special about that piano? What would it feel like to play an instrument with such history, such meaning? He opened his satchel and pulled out the sheet music for their upcoming concert, Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. The pages were already dog-eared from his practice sessions, certain passages marked with pencil notes from his preparations. Li Wei placed his fingers on the keys and began to play, softly at first, then with growing confidence as the familiar notes filled the small room. He closed his eyes, imagining not the upright before him, but the gleaming grand in the concert hall. What was its story? Who had played it before? What secrets did it hold within its strings and hammers? As he played, something shifted in his approach. Rather than focusing on proving his own skill, showing off his technique, his years of training, he found himself listening more deeply to the voice of the piano itself. Even this humble upright had a unique character, a particular way it responded to his touch. The afternoon slipped away unnoticed as Li Wei lost himself in the music. He played the concerto from memory, then improvised, then worked through technical exercises, not to perfect his playing but to better understand this new instrument under his hands. He was so absorbed that he didn't notice the door opening slightly, didn't see Maestro Vittorio standing silently in the hallway, listening with an unreadable expression on his face. When Li Wei finally emerged from the practice room, the concert hall was dark and nearly empty. A janitor mopped the floor near the entrance and a few administrative staff gathered their things to leave for the day. "You're still here," a voice observed. The friendly violinist from that morning was packing up his instrument. "I thought you might have run for the hills after this morning." Li Wei shook his head. "I still have a job to do, don't I? Even if it's on an upright instead of a grand." The violinist studied him for a moment, then smiled. "You know, the last new pianist spent his first day complaining to anyone who would listen about how unfairly he'd been treated." He extended his hand. "I'm David, by the way, Li Wei." They shook hands. "And I did plenty of complaining, but only to myself." David laughed. "Smart man. Look, a few of us usually grab dinner after Wednesday rehearsals. Why don't you join us tonight? We can fill you in on all of Vittorio's quirks and maybe help you plot your path to piano approval." For the first time since that morning's disaster, Li Wei felt himself relax. "I'd like that," he said, "though I'm starting to think that path might be longer than I expected." "Oh, it definitely will be," David assured him cheerfully. "But trust me, when you finally sit at that grand and play your first notes with the orchestra behind you." He closed his eyes briefly, as if savoring a delicious memory. "There's nothing else like it in the world." As they walked out into the evening air, Li Wei glanced back at the darkened concert hall. Somewhere inside sat the forbidden piano waiting, a challenge and a promise wrapped in polished ebony and ivory. Tomorrow he would return with new purpose. The path to that piano might be long and difficult, but he was beginning to suspect it might also be exactly the journey he needed. 3 weeks had passed since Li Wei's first day with the Westmoreland Symphony Orchestra, and life had fallen into a strange, frustrating rhythm. Every morning he would arrive early, hoping to catch even 15 minutes alone with the grand piano before Maestro Vittorio appeared. And every morning the conductor would somehow materialize just as Li Wei's fingers hovered above the keys. "Not today," Vittorio would say, sometimes gently, sometimes sharply, depending on his mood. Then he would gesture toward the practice room, and Li Wei would dutifully retreat to his upright piano exile. The orchestra was preparing for their season highlight, Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, but Li Wei wasn't the one rehearsing with them. Instead, Vittorio had brought in a series of guest pianists, accomplished musicians who were granted immediate access to the forbidden grand piano. "It's not fair," Li Wei complained one evening as he sat with David and several other orchestra members at a small restaurant near the concert hall. "I was hired to be the pianist. How am I supposed to prove myself if I never get to play with the orchestra?" "Patience," advised Mrs. Huang, sipping her tea. The second violinist had become something of a mentor to Li Wei over the past weeks. "Vittorio tests everyone this way. He wants to see if you're serious enough to wait. But the Rachmaninoff concert is in 2 weeks," Li Wei pointed out. "At this rate, I'll still be playing to an empty practice room while someone else gets the spotlight." David, who had appointed himself Li Wei's unofficial guide to orchestra politics, leaned forward. "You know what your problem is? You're still thinking about this as a job. For Vittorio, that piano isn't just an instrument. It's his most precious connection to music itself." Li Wei pushed his food around his plate. "So what am I supposed to do? Just keep practicing on that old upright forever?" "Not forever," Mrs. Huang said with a small smile. "Just until you understand what David is telling you. The piano isn't a tool for your career. It's a voice that deserves respect." Li Wei wanted to argue, but deep down he knew they were right. He had been approaching this all wrong, thinking about how the situation affected him rather than understanding what the piano meant to Vittorio. The next morning, Li Wei arrived at the concert hall even earlier than usual. The cleaning staff was still there, dusting the seats and mopping the floors. He nodded to them as he made his way not to the grand piano on stage, but to the back of the hall where he could sit and simply observe. From this distance, the piano looked like a sleeping giant, its polished surface reflecting the stage lights. Li Wei watched it in silence, trying to see it through Vittorio's eyes. What stories did it hold? What memories? What magic? He was so lost in thought that he didn't notice someone sit down beside him until they spoke. "Beautiful, isn't she?" Li Wei startled. Maestro Vittorio was beside him, gazing at the piano with something like reverence in his eyes. "Yes," Li Wei agreed softly. "She is." Vittorio turned to study him. 3 weeks, and this is the first time I've seen you look at her without wanting to possess her." Li Wei felt his cheeks warm. "I'm starting to understand. It's not just about playing any piano. It's about being worthy of that one." A flicker of approval crossed Vittorio's face. "My teacher, Giuseppe Rinaldi, played that piano for 60 years. He could make it whisper secrets that would break your heart. When his arthritis became too painful for him to perform anymore, he would sit beside me as I played and say, 'No, no, listen to what she wants to tell you.'" The conductor's eyes grew distant with memory. "I thought he was being poetic. It took me years to understand he was being literal." Li Wei glanced at him in surprise. "You believe the piano speaks?" "Not with words," Vittorio said. "But yes, she speaks. Every great instrument has its own voice, its own soul. Most musicians are too busy showing off their technique to listen." He fixed Li Wei with a penetrating stare. "Are you listening yet, Mr. Chen? Or are you still trying to prove how well you can play?" Before Li Wei could answer, the hall doors opened and the rest of the orchestra began to file in. Vittorio rose to his feet. "Keep practicing," he said, "but practice listening as much as playing." Then he was gone, striding toward the stage to begin rehearsal. That day, watching from the back of the hall, Li Wei paid more attention to the guest pianist than he had before. The woman was technically flawless, her fingers dancing over the keys with precision and speed. But something was missing from her performance, something he couldn't quite name. During the lunch break, while most musicians went out for food, Li Wei slipped into the now empty hall and approached the piano. He didn't touch it, just stood beside it, studying its details. The small scratches in the wood that told stories of decades of use. The subtle patina of age on the black surface. The worn spots on the bench where countless pianists had sat before. "May I?" he asked softly, as if the piano itself might answer. When no objection came from the piano or anyone else, Li Wei carefully sat on the bench. Still, he didn't touch the keys. Instead, he closed his eyes and simply absorbed the feeling of being there, at the heart of the orchestra's space where the music came alive. He imagined what it would feel like to play here, with 40 skilled musicians creating a tapestry of sound around him. How different it would be from practicing alone in the small room with its upright piano. How alive the music would become. What are you doing? Li Wei's eyes snapped open. Vittorio stood at the edge of the stage, watching him with an unreadable expression. I'm not playing, Li Wei said quickly. I just wanted to sit with her for a moment. To his surprise, Vittorio didn't look angry. And what did you learn? Li Wei considered the question carefully. That I've been thinking about this all wrong. I've been practicing the notes but not feeling the music. I've been trying to master a piece without understanding its heart. Vittorio's expression softened slightly. Perhaps there is hope for you yet, Mr. Chen. He gestured toward the piano. Since you're here, why not play something? Something simple. Something honest. Li Wei's heart raced. Was this a test, a trick? But the look in Vittorio's eyes was genuine. Carefully, reverently, Li Wei placed his fingers on the keys for the first time. The first notes of Debussy's Clair de Lune filled the hall. Li Wei had chosen it not to show off his technical skill, but because its gentle beauty had always spoken to him. As he played, he forgot about Vittorio watching. Forgot about his frustrations of the past weeks. Forgot everything except the conversation between his fingers and the piano keys. The sound that emerged was unlike anything he had produced on the practice room upright. This piano responded to the lightest touch, singing with a clarity and depth that took his breath away. Each note seemed to hang in the air a moment longer than it should, creating harmonies that shimmered like moonlight on water. When the final chord faded into silence, Li Wei sat motionless, almost afraid to break the spell that had fallen over the hall. Well, Vittorio said finally, it seems she doesn't find your touch entirely objectionable. It wasn't exactly high praise, but coming from Vittorio, it felt like winning a competition. Li Wei smiled. Thank you for giving me this chance. Don't get too excited, Vittorio warned. Playing alone in an empty hall is one thing. Playing with my orchestra is another matter entirely. He consulted his watch. The others will be back soon. You should return to your practice room. Li Wei stood, reluctantly moving away from the piano. Will I ever get to play with them, maestro? Before the Rachmaninoff concert? Vittorio's eyebrows shot up. You think you're ready for Rachmaninoff? After one passable rendition of Debussy? No, Li Wei admitted. But I'm starting to understand what I need to learn. And I can't learn it fully without experiencing how the piano speaks with the orchestra around it. The conductor studied him for a long moment. Continue with your practice. We'll see, it wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. For Li Wei, that tiny opening was enough to fuel his determination. Over the next few days, his approach to practice changed dramatically. Instead of running through the Rachmaninoff concerto repeatedly, trying to perfect every technical challenge, he began to spend time simply listening to recordings of the piece, closing his eyes to feel how the piano and orchestra conversed with each other. In the evenings, after most people had gone home, he would sometimes sit in the back of the hall while one of the cleaning staff worked nearby. He would close his eyes and imagine playing the grand piano, not visualizing his fingers on the keys but feeling the music flow through him. Sometimes he would softly hum parts of the concerto, focusing on the emotional journey of the piece rather than the notes themselves. David noticed the change in him during their now regular dinner gatherings. You seem different, the violinist observed. Less frustrated, more, I don't know, centered? Li Wei smiled. I think I finally understand what you and Mrs. Huang were trying to tell me. It's not about me at all. It's about the music, Mrs. Huang nodded approvingly. Vittorio will notice. He sees everything. Maybe, Li Wei said, but that's not why I'm doing it anymore. And he realized with some surprise that it was true. His desire to play the grand piano had transformed from ambition to something closer to reverence. Well, whatever you're doing, keep it up, David advised. Because rumor has it that our guest pianist for the Rachmaninoff concert is having visa issues and might not me. Li Wei's heart skipped a beat, but he kept his expression neutral. That's unfortunate for the orchestra. Yes, Mrs. Huang agreed with a twinkle in her eye. Very unfortunate. I wonder who might step in on such short notice. Li Wei took a sip of his tea to hide his smile. For the first time since joining the orchestra, Hope flickered to life within him. Not just hope of playing the grand piano, but hope of truly understanding its voice. Disaster struck 2 days before the Rachmaninoff concert. Li Wei arrived at the concert hall that morning to find the atmosphere charged with tension. Musicians huddled in small groups, speaking in hushed voices that fell silent whenever Vittorio passed by. The conductor himself looked as though he hadn't slept, his silver hair more disheveled than usual, his movements sharp and agitated as he arranged his score sheets. "What's going on?" Li Wei asked David when he finally spotted the friendly violinist near the water cooler. David glanced around to make sure Vittorio wasn't within earshot. Katerina Petrova, the guest pianist for the concert, is stuck in Berlin. Some kind of visa problem. She called Vittorio at 5 this morning to tell him she definitely can't make it. Li Wei's heart began to race. What will happen to the concert? That's the million-dollar question, David said. Vittorio's been on the phone all morning trying to find a replacement, but it's not looking good. 2 days isn't enough notice for most pianists to prepare Rachmaninoff. Most pianists don't already know it by heart, Li Wei murmured, almost to himself. David raised an eyebrow. Are you thinking what I think you're thinking? Before Li Wei could answer, Mrs. Huang appeared at his elbow. Vittorio wants to see you, she said quietly. In his office now. The walk to Vittorio's office felt like the longest journey of Li Wei's life. His palms were sweating and his mind raced through 1,000 possibilities. Could this be his chance? Or was Vittorio going to ask him to help find another pianist? Maybe the conductor simply wanted to cancel rehearsal for the day. Vittorio's office was a small room off the main hallway, its walls covered with framed concert programs and photographs of the conductor with famous musicians. The conductor himself sat behind a desk cluttered with scores and coffee cups, looking up sharply when Li Wei knocked on the open door. Mr. Chen. Come in. Vittorio gestured to the chair across from him. Close the door. Li Wei did as he was told, then sat down, trying to keep his expression neutral despite the hammering of his heart. You've heard about Ms. Petrova, I assume? Vittorio asked. Yes, Maestro. David mentioned she's having visa issues. Issues is a polite way of putting it, Vittorio scoffed. She's been detained for questioning because some idiot at border control confused her with another Katerina Petrova, who's wanted for fraud. He rubbed his temples. The point is, she won't be here for the concert. Li Wei nodded, uncertain what to say. I've called every pianist I know, Vittorio continued. No one is available on such short notice who can handle Rachmaninoff at the level this orchestra requires. He fixed Li Wei with a penetrating stare. Which brings me to you. The room suddenly seemed too warm. Li Wei loosened his collar slightly. Me? You've been practicing the concerto, haven't you? In that little room with the upright piano? Yes, but you don't think you're ready, Vittorio finished for him. And you're probably right. Rachmaninoff's Second is one of the most challenging concertos in the repertoire. It requires not just technical skill, but emotional maturity and a deep connection with the orchestra. He leaned back in his chair. Under normal circumstances, I would never consider putting a pianist with your limited experience in such a position. Li Wei's heart sank. I understand, Maestro. However, Vittorio continued, these are not normal circumstances. We have a sold-out concert in 2 days and no pianist. He drummed his fingers on the desk. So I have a proposition for you. Li Wei held his breath. Audition for me. Today. Now. If, and this is a very big if, you convince me you can handle the piece without embarrassing yourself or my orchestra, I'll consider letting you play the concert. It was more than Li Wei had dared hope for, but there was something in Vittorio's tone that made him uneasy. Thank you for the opportunity, Maestro. I won't let you down. Don't thank me yet, Vittorio warned. There's a condition. What condition? Vittorio's lips curved in a smile that didn't reach his eyes. You'll play with your eyes closed. Li Wei blinked. I'm sorry. You heard me, closed. From the first note to the last. Vittorio stood up. If you truly understand that piano, if you can feel its voice rather than just play its keys, then seeing should be unnecessary. Li Wei's mind reeled. Playing with eyes closed for a few measures was one thing. Many pianists did it during particularly emotional passages. But an entire concerto? With an orchestra? It seemed impossible. Is that really necessary? He asked carefully. No, Vittorio admitted. It's a test. One that will tell me everything I need to know about whether you're ready to sit at that piano in front of an audience. He moved toward the door. The orchestra will be ready in 15 minutes. I suggest you use that time to prepare yourself. After Vittorio left, Li Wei sat frozen in the chair, his thoughts churning. Playing with eyes closed wasn't just difficult, it was potentially disastrous. Without visual cues, how would he know where his fingers were landing? How would he connect with the orchestra? How would he follow Vittorio's conducting? But even as these doubts crowded his mind, another voice spoke up, quieter but more certain. Hadn't he spent weeks imagining playing that piano? Hadn't he practiced the Rachmaninoff in his mind, feeling the keys beneath his fingers even when he wasn't physically touching them? And something else Vittorio had said resonated. If you truly understand that piano, then seeing should be unnecessary. Li Wei took a deep breath and stood up. Instead of heading directly to the concert hall, he walked to his small practice room. The familiar upright piano waited for him there, patient and unassuming after their many hours together. He sat down at the bench and placed his hands on the keys, but didn't press them. Instead, he closed his eyes and began to visualize the grand piano on stage. In his mind, he could see every detail, the subtle grain of the black wood, the ivory keys with their slight variations in color, the precise distance between each key. He let his fingers move through the opening chords of the Rachmaninoff concerto, not making a sound on the upright, just feeling the shape of the music in his hands. He imagined the weight of the grand piano's keys, heavier than the upright, requiring more intention behind each press. When he opened his eyes again, Li Wei was surprised to find that 10 minutes had passed. It was time. The orchestra was arranged on stage when he arrived, the musicians watching him with expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism to encouragement. Mrs. Huang gave him a small nod. David flashed a quick thumbs up, and there at the center of it all was the grand piano. Waiting. Vittorio stood at his podium, baton in hand. "Mr. Chen," he acknowledged. "Are you ready?" "No," Li Wei thought. But he said, "Yes, maestro. Remember our agreement." Eyes closed. Li Wei nodded, then walked to the piano. He adjusted the bench, feeling the smooth wood beneath his fingers. Then he sat down, placed his hands in position for the opening chords, and closed his eyes. For a terrible moment, panic threatened to overwhelm him. What was he doing? This was madness. He should open his eyes, tell Vittorio this was impossible, walk away before he humiliated himself in front of the entire orchestra. But then he remembered what Vittorio had told him about his teacher. Listen to what she wants to tell you. Not just words, but a philosophy, a way of connecting with music that went beyond sight, beyond technique, beyond the physical act of playing. Li Wei took a deep breath and waited for Vittorio's. The conductor raised his baton, a movement Li Wei sensed rather than saw, and then gave the downbeat. The orchestra began the concerto's famous introduction, the somber chords building in intensity. Li Wei counted the measures, feeling the music swell around him. When his entrance approached, he let instinct guide his hands to the keys. The first chords rang out, powerful and resonant. Without his sight, Li Wei's other senses heightened. He could feel the subtle vibrations of the piano through his fingertips, could hear the complex harmonics of each note in a way he never had before. The piano seemed to come alive beneath his hands, responsive to his lightest touch. As the first movement progressed, something remarkable happened. Without the distraction of watching his fingers, watching the conductor, watching the orchestra, Li Wei found himself sinking deeper into the music than he ever had before. He wasn't just playing the notes, he was feeling them, breathing with them, becoming the channel through which Rachmaninoff's emotions flowed. There were mistakes, a few missed notes, a moment when he briefly lost synchronization with the orchestra, but instead of derailing him, these small errors simply became part of the journey. He adjusted, recovered, continued. By the time they reached the end of the first movement, Li Wei had forgotten his nervousness. He had forgotten he was auditioning. He had even forgotten that his eyes were closed. There was only the music, the piano, and the mysterious conversation between them. When the last note of the movement faded, there was a moment of absolute silence. Then, to Li Wei's surprise, spontaneous applause broke out among the orchestra members. He opened his eyes, blinking against the sudden light, to find the musicians smiling and nodding approvingly. Even Vittorio's stern expression had softened into something that, if not quite a smile, was at least not a frown. "Well," the conductor said, tapping his baton against his stand to restore order. "It seems you've been holding out on us, Mr. Chen. Does this mean—" Li Wei couldn't bring himself to finish the question. Vittorio considered him for a long moment. "It means we continue." Second movement. "Eyes closed again, if you please." It wasn't a definitive answer, but it was enough. Li Wei closed his eyes once more, his fingers finding their positions with a confidence he hadn't possessed before. As the orchestra began the lyrical, heartbreaking melody of the second movement, Li Wei felt something shift within him. The fear was gone, replaced by a sense of profound connection, not just with the piano, but with every musician on that stage, with Vittorio's guidance, and with the composer's intentions across the span of a century. For the first time since joining the orchestra, Li Wei understood what Vittorio had been trying to tell him all along. This wasn't about proving himself. It wasn't about technical perfection. It wasn't even about the concert. It was about finding the soul of the music and letting it speak through him. At the end of the audition, exhausted but exhilarated, Li Wei opened his eyes to find the entire orchestra looking at him with newfound respect. Even Vittorio's usual stern expression had softened. "Well," the conductor said, setting down his baton, "it appears we have a pianist for our concert." A ripple of excited murmurs spread through the orchestra. David shot Li Wei a grin and a thumbs up. Mrs. Huang nodded approvingly. "Thank you, Maestro," Li Wei said, his voice thick with emotion. "I won't let you down." "See that you don't," Vittorio replied, but there was no bite in his words. "We have only 2 days to prepare. I expect you here at 7 tomorrow morning for a private rehearsal before the full orchestra arrives." As the musicians began to pack up their instruments, many came by to congratulate Li Wei. David clapped him on the shoulder. "I knew you had it in you. The way you played that second movement. I actually got chills." "Thanks," Li Wei said, still somewhat dazed by everything that had happened. "I just hope I can do it again with my eyes closed in front of a full audience." Mrs. Huang overheard him. "You won't be playing with your eyes closed at the concert," she said, looking confused. Li Wei turned to her in surprise. "But Vittorio said that was just for the audition," she explained with a small smile. "His way of testing if you truly understand the piano. No one actually performs Rachmaninoff with their eyes closed." Relief washed over Li Wei, followed quickly by doubt. Had the closed eyes requirement been the only reason he'd connected so deeply with the music? Would he be able to recreate that feeling with his eyes open? These questions followed him home that evening. He should have been celebrating his breakthrough, but instead he found himself restless, pacing his small apartment, playing passages in the air with phantom fingers. Around midnight, unable to sleep, Li Wei sat at the edge of his bed and closed his eyes. He mentally walked through the entire concerto, feeling each note, each dynamic shift, each emotional peak and valley. When he reached the triumphant finale, he realized something important. The closed eyes hadn't been a handicap. They'd been a gift. They had forced him to listen differently, to feel differently, to trust something deeper than sight. At 6:30 the next morning, Li Wei arrived at the concert hall to find Vittorio already there, sitting alone in the front row staring at the grand piano on stage. "Good morning, Maestro," Li Wei said, setting down his bag. Vittorio didn't turn around. "My teacher used to say that a true pianist prepares for a performance not by practicing until the last minute, but by conversing with the silence before the music begins." He finally looked at Li Wei. "Did you sleep well?" "Honestly? Not really." Vittorio nodded as if this was the correct answer. "Good. Nerves sharpen the senses." He stood up. "Now tell me what you learned yesterday." Li Wei considered the question carefully. "I learned that when I stopped trying to control every aspect of the music and instead let it flow through me, something magical happens." "And do you think you can recreate this magic with your eyes open?" Vittorio asked, echoing the very doubt that had kept Li Wei awake. "I don't know," Li Wei admitted. "But I'd like to try something if you'll permit it." Vittorio raised an eyebrow, then gestured toward the piano. "Be my guest." Li Wei climbed the steps to the stage and settled at the piano bench. He placed his hands on the keys, then looked at Vittorio. "Yesterday, playing with my eyes closed helped me hear the piano in a new way. But I think what really matters isn't whether my eyes are open or closed. It's where my attention is focused. He began to play the opening of the concerto's first movement. But this time, instead of closing his eyes completely, he simply softened his gaze, looking through the piano rather than at it, keeping his awareness centered on the sound and feel of the instrument. The result wasn't quite as transcendent as the day before, but it was close. Li-Wei could still sense the piano's unique voice responding to his touch, could still feel the music taking shape between them. When he finished the passage, he looked up to find Vittorio watching him intently. "Interesting approach," the conductor said. "Not perfect, but promising. Let's work with it." For the next hour, they explored different ways for Li-Wei to maintain that deep connection with the piano while still being able to watch Vittorio's conducting. They discovered that brief moments of closed eyes during particularly emotional passages actually enhanced the performance, creating a visible representation of Li-Wei's internal journey through the music. By the time the rest of the orchestra arrived at 9, they had developed a fluid approach that allowed Li-Wei to shift between different states of awareness throughout the concerto. The full rehearsal went surprisingly well. There were rough spots, of course, moments when Li-Wei's timing didn't quite match the orchestra's, passages where the balance of volume needed adjustment. But overall, there was a chemistry between soloist, orchestra, and conductor that even the most skeptical musicians could feel. During the lunch break, David found Li-Wei sitting alone in the practice room, staring at his hands. "Everything okay?" the violinist asked. "You were amazing out there." Li-Wei smiled weakly. "Just nervous about tomorrow, I guess. What if I freeze up? What if I forget the notes? What if I can't find that connection again when there are 800 people watching me?" David sat down beside him. "Want to know a secret? Everyone feels that way before a big performance. Even Vittorio, though he'd never admit it." He nudged Li-Wei's shoulder. "But here's the thing. When the moment comes, all that fear transforms into energy, into presence, into music. You sound like you're speaking from experience," Li-Wei observed. "Let's just say I wasn't always second violin in this orchestra," David replied with a hint of sadness. "I had my shot at a solo career once. Stage fright got the better of me." He shook his head. "But that's not going to happen to you. You have something special, Li-Wei. I saw it yesterday when you played with your eyes closed. You disappeared into the music completely." Li-Wei thought about this. "How do I make sure I can do that again?" "Trust," David said simply. "Trust the piano. Trust the orchestra. Trust Vittorio, as crazy as that sounds. But most of all, trust yourself." The rest of the day passed in a blur of rehearsals, adjustments, and final preparations. By evening, Li-Wei was physically exhausted but mentally wired, his mind still racing with passages from the concerto. Vittorio found him still at the piano long after everyone else had left. "Enough," the conductor said firmly. "Go home, rest. The piano will be here tomorrow." Li-Wei reluctantly stood up. "I just want to make sure everything is perfect." "Perfect?" Vittorio scoffed. "There is no perfect in music. There is only honest." He studied Li-Wei for a moment. "You're still worried about tomorrow?" It wasn't a question, but Li-Wei nodded anyway. "Come with me," Vittorio said abruptly. "There's something you should see." He led Li-Wei to his office and pulled a photo album from a bookshelf. Opening it to a specific page, he pointed to a black and white photograph of a young man seated at a familiar-looking piano. "That's you," Li-Wei realized. "Age 19, Vittorio confirmed. "My first solo performance with a professional orchestra. I was terrified." He turned the page to a newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Young pianist shows promise despite nervous performance." "Not exactly a rave review," Li-Wei said. Vittorio chuckled. "No, I made mistakes. I rushed some passages and dragged others. But do you know what my teacher said when I showed him this review?" He closed the album. He said, "Good, now you know the worst that can happen. You played nervously, and yet the world continues to turn." Li-Wei considered this. "So you're telling me it's okay if I mess up tomorrow?" "I'm telling you," Vittorio said, "that fear of failure is a greater obstacle than failure itself. Yes, you might miss some notes. You might lose the connection with the piano momentarily, but what matters is how you recover, how you continue." He put the album back on the shelf. "The audience doesn't come to hear perfection. They come to witness a human being having a conversation with music." Li-Wei let these words sink in. For weeks he'd been so focused on proving himself worthy of the piano that he'd forgotten the ultimate purpose, to share music with others. "Thank you, Maestro," he said finally. "For everything. For pushing me, for testing me, even for keeping me away from the piano at first." Vittorio waved away his gratitude. "Save your thanks for after the concert. Now go home and sleep. That's an order." But sleep proved elusive once again. Instead of tossing and turning, however, Li Wei decided to try something different. He pushed aside his furniture to create a clear space in his living room. Then, sitting cross-legged on the floor, he closed his eyes and began a breathing exercise his first piano teacher had taught him long ago. Inhale for 4 counts. Hold for 7. Exhale for 8. As his breathing slowed, Li Wei imagined himself walking onto the stage tomorrow. He felt the weight of the audience's attention, the momentary flutter of nerves in his stomach. He accepted these feelings, letting them wash over him without resistance. In his mind, he sat at the piano, placed his hands on the keys, and made eye contact with Vittorio. He felt the hushed anticipation of the moment before the music begins, that precious silence that makes the first note possible. Then, still in his imagination, he began to play. But this time, he didn't focus on playing all the right notes or following Vittorio's conducting perfectly. Instead, he simply allowed himself to be present with the music, to listen deeply to the piano's voice, to feel the support of the orchestra around him. When Li Wei finally opened his eyes, he was surprised to find that hours had passed. It was nearly dawn. In a few hours, he would be at the concert hall for the final rehearsal before tonight's performance. But something had changed during his visualization. The nervous energy that had kept him awake was gone, replaced by a calm readiness. Whatever happened at the concert, whether he played perfectly or made mistakes, whether the audience cheered or merely applauded politely, Li Wei knew he had already achieved something important. He had learned to listen to the piano, to respect its voice, to serve the music rather than his own ego. As the first light of morning filtered through his window, Li Wei finally drifted off to sleep. His dreams filled not with anxiety but with music. Beautiful, imperfect, human music. The night of the concert arrived with the swift inevitability of fate. Outside the Westmoreland Concert Hall, a line of people wrapped around the block, their breath visible in the cool evening air as they waited for the doors to open. Inside backstage, Li Wei paced in a small green room. His concert attire, a simple black suit, feeling suddenly too tight around the collar. A gentle knock on the door interrupted his nervous pacing. Mrs. Huang peeked in, already dressed in the orchestra's formal black attire. 20 minutes until places, she said. How are you feeling? Li Wei attempted a smile. Like I might throw up, she laughed softly. That's normal. I still feel that way sometimes after 30 years with this orchestra. She entered the room fully and closed the door behind her. I brought you something. From her pocket, she withdrew a small, smooth stone polished to a gentle sheen. My first teacher gave me this before my first recital, she explained. It's nothing special, just a river stone, but holding something solid can help ground you when your mind starts to float away with nerves. Li Wei accepted the stone, surprised by its comforting weight in his palm. Thank you, he said, closing his fingers around it. I'll keep it in my pocket. Mrs. Huang nodded approvingly. Remember, everyone out there is on your side. They want you to succeed. Even Vittorio, though he'd never say it. After she left, Li Wei continued to hold the stone, running his thumb over its smooth surface. He closed his eyes and took several deep breaths just as he had practiced the night before. The weight of the stone in his hand kept him anchored in the present moment, preventing his thoughts from spinning into worst-case scenarios. Another knock came, harder this time. Vittorio entered without waiting for a response. It's time, the conductor said, his own formal attire making him look even more imposing than usual. Li Wei nodded, carefully placing Mrs. Huang's stone in his pocket. I'm ready. Vittorio studied him for a moment, then did something unexpected. He extended his hand. Remember what I told you? The audience isn't here for perfection. They're here for honesty. Li Wei shook the conductor's hand, surprised by the warmth of his grip. I'll remember. They walked together down the backstage corridor, the muffled sounds of the audience growing louder with each step. At the edge of the stage, Vittorio paused. Wait here. The orchestra enters first, then me. I'll introduce you and then it's your moment. He straightened Li Wei's tie slightly. Look at them. Acknowledge them. Then forget they exist and speak only to the piano. Before Leeway could respond, Vittorio was gone, striding onto the stage to the sound of applause. The orchestra followed, their formal black attire creating a living shadow against the golden wood of the stage. Through the curtain, Leeway watched as they took their seats, adjusted their instruments, and settled into that special alertness that precedes great music. He could hear Vittorio speaking to the audience, explaining the last-minute change in pianists. A young talent from our own ranks, making his debut as soloist tonight. Leeway touched the stone in his pocket, took one final deep breath, and stepped onto the stage. The brightness hit him first. The stage lights were far more intense than during rehearsals, turning the audience into a dark, faceless mass beyond a wall of light. As he walked toward the piano at center stage, he could feel hundreds of eyes following him, could hear the polite applause that seemed to say, "Who is this person replacing the pianist we expected to see?" The walk to the piano felt endless. When he finally reached it, Leeway bowed to the audience, then to the orchestra, and finally to Vittorio. The conductor gave him a nearly imperceptible nod of encouragement. Leeway sat down at the bench and adjusted it slightly, his hands hovering above the keys. In that moment of silence, with the collective breath of 800 people held in anticipation, he felt a sudden clarity. All the weeks of practice, of frustration, of growth, they had led to this moment. Not just to perform, but to share something true. He placed his fingers on the keys, feeling their cool smoothness. Then he looked up at Vittorio, ready for the cue to begin. The conductor raised his baton. The orchestra tensed, instruments at the ready. And then the downbeat came, releasing the first notes of Rachmaninoff's concerto into the hall like birds taking flight. The orchestra began with that famous introduction, the dark, rising chords that set the emotional tone for everything to follow. Leeway counted the measures, feeling the music build around him. When his entrance approached, he took a breath, and then his fingers found the keys. The first chords rang out, bold and resonant. The piano's voice filled the hall, speaking with an authority that surprised even Leeway. Yes, this was Rachmaninoff's music, notes written nearly a century ago, but in this moment it felt newly created, alive with immediate emotion. As the first movement unfolded, Leeway found himself slipping into that special awareness he had discovered during the audition. His eyes remained open, watching Vittorio when necessary, but his focus had turned inward, to the conversation between his hands and the piano. There were moments when he briefly closed his eyes during particularly emotional passages, just as he and Vittorio had practiced. In those moments, he could feel the audience leaning forward, drawn into the vulnerability of a musician, surrendering completely to the music. The first movement ended with a flourish, Leeway's hands lifting from the keys as the final chord resonated through the hall. There was a beat of silence, that precious moment when the music still hangs in the air before dissolving into memory. And then a wave of applause washed over him, stronger than mere politeness. Leeway exchanged a quick glance with Vittorio. The conductor's expression remained professional, but there was a new light in his eyes, a recognition of something shared. As the applause died down, Leeway prepared for the second movement, the heart of the concerto, with its achingly beautiful melody that has moved listeners for generations. This was the movement he had connected with most deeply during his practice sessions, the one that spoke to his own journey of struggle and discovery. He began the solo introduction, his fingers caressing rather than striking the keys. The melody emerged like a voice in the darkness, tentative at first, then growing in confidence. When the orchestra joined, adding layers of harmony and counterpoint, Leeway felt his throat tighten with emotion. This was what he had been seeking all along, not just to play the notes correctly, but to disappear into the music so completely that performer and performance became one. The movement progressed, building to its climactic middle section before returning to the tender theme of the opening. Throughout, Leeway maintained that delicate balance, technically precise yet emotionally open, aware of Vittorio's direction yet free within his interpretation. When the final notes of the second movement faded away, Leeway knew something special was happening. The audience remained absolutely silent, as if breathing would break the spell. Even Vittorio seemed affected, taking a moment longer than usual before preparing for the third movement. The finale began with explosive energy, the tempo faster, the rhythms more driving. Here was where technical challenges awaited, rapid passages requiring absolute precision, complex coordination between soloist and orchestra. Midway through, Li Wei encountered the first real difficulty of the evening. A particularly intricate passage, one he had practiced hundreds of times, suddenly felt foreign under his fingers. For a terrifying moment, he thought he might derail completely, but then he remembered Vittorio's words. What matters is how you recover, how you continue. Instead of panicking, Li Wei took a quick breath, found his place in the music, and continued. The slight hesitation was noticeable, perhaps only to him and Vittorio. But the recovery, the way he leaned into the next phrase with renewed commitment, was evident to everyone. As the concerto raced toward its conclusion, Li Wei felt a strange combination of exhaustion and exhilaration. His fingers burned with effort, his back ached from tension, but his spirit soared with the music. The final pages of the score demanded everything he had, physically, emotionally, spiritually, and he gave it freely. The last chords arrived, orchestra and piano united in a triumphant declaration. Li Wei struck the final notes with absolute conviction, his hands lifting from the keyboard as the sound rang through the hall. Vittorio held the orchestra for one perfect moment, then released them with a decisive gesture. Silence. Complete. Absolute silence. And then the audience erupted. The applause was immediate and overwhelming, people rising to their feet in a wave that spread from the front row to the back of the hall. The sound was deafening, punctuated by shouts of "Bravo!" and whistles of appreciation. Li Wei sat stunned at the piano, his hands still hovering above the keys. The emotion of the moment, the release after weeks of tension, the joy of connection, the simple relief of completion, threatened to overwhelm him. Vittorio extended his hand, inviting Li Wei to stand and acknowledge the audience. As he rose on slightly shaky legs, the orchestra joined the applause. Some members tapping their bows against music stands in a musician's highest form of approval. Li Wei bowed deeply to the audience, then turned to acknowledge the orchestra and finally Vittorio. When he faced the conductor, he was shocked to see something glistening in the older man's eyes. Vittorio clasped his hand firmly, then did something unprecedented. He embraced Li Wei briefly before stepping back to allow him the spotlight. 3 curtain calls later, the applause still showing no signs of diminishing, Li Wei found himself standing beside the piano, one hand resting on its polished surface. In that moment of triumph, he remembered his first day with the orchestra, when Vittorio had shouted, "Don't touch my piano, poor guy." How far he had come since then, not just in being allowed to play the piano, but in understanding why it mattered so much, why music itself mattered. As he took his final bow and left the stage, the audience still on their feet behind him, Li Wei knew that something fundamental had changed. He had arrived at the orchestra as a pianist looking to advance his career. He was leaving the stage as a musician who had found his voice. Backstage, amid the congratulations of the orchestra members, Vittorio approached him one last time. The conductor's usual stern expression had returned, but there was a new respect in his eyes as he spoke quietly, so only Li Wei could hear. "It was never my piano," he said. "It was always waiting for the right person to truly listen to its voice." He placed a hand briefly on Li Wei's shoulder. Tonight it found that person, and in that simple acknowledgement Li Wei received the greatest recognition of all, not just acceptance, but understanding. The understanding that music isn't something we possess, but something we serve, a voice we help to speak, a truth we help to tell. With Mrs. Huang's stone still in his pocket and the sound of applause still echoing in his ears, Li Wei realized he had found what he had truly been seeking all along, not just a place at a prestigious piano, but a place in the endless, beautiful conversation between musicians and music that stretches across time, connecting heart to heart, generation to generation, one note at a time.